If she were here, I'd sleep, Leo said, and the ice cream in my hand melted a little faster than it should have. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes tracked the line where the boardwalk met the sea, where gulls scratched at the shadows of umbrellas. He said it the way 4-year-olds say the most dangerous things, plain and true, with no performances attached. The truck behind us smelled of vanilla and lemon oil, a combination that had once sounded like summer on a postcard, and now settled into me like memory. Soft, sticky, impossible to fold away. Mara handed Leo a cone with a faint, efficient smile. She wore knitted scoops on her cap that matched the one stitched into her apron, and when she touched his hand, it was as if the world remembered to stop being sharp for a second. I had come that morning with a map and a laptop, the professional instruments I used to measure setbacks and lines and property limits. I left them open in my lap like props, the keys clicking occasionally as if to remind me of a life that still expected me at a desk. I left that life the day I signed the temporary guardianship papers, not in a ceremony, but in a cramped county office a month after the crash. The signers were polite, the clerk efficient. The forms smelled faintly of printer toner and institutional hope. I had been a city planner for 12 years, someone who drew tidy edges on messy places, who could tell you how far a building had to sit back to hold its foundation against the beach. My calendar used to be the ledger of my identity, meetings, presentations, grant deadlines. I had traded that ledger, willingly or otherwise, for Leo's small hand and a phone number that began to look like a home. The act of leaving was not a single dramatic step. It accumulated in decisions, hanging up my tie, quitting a committee I had chaired, telling my supervisor I needed time. It was ordinary erasures that added up to a different shape of life. People said I stepped up. Sam, my lawyer, said it with a suitable amount of caution in his voice, as if gratitude must be rationed when legal stakes were involved. "You did the responsible thing, Eli," he said once. His caution was a mirror to my own internal accounting. Responsible, yes. Safe, not necessarily. I could feel the old habits, inventorying risk, thinking in contingencies, becoming the instruments I used to keep us afloat. That counted as stewardship, I told myself nightly when I checked the locks and made lists. Mara's presence on the boardwalk had always been part of the rhythm of this town, like the bells at the church steeple, or the way the tide left a clean line of shells. She arrived early, folding her cart from an industrial bag into a compact, efficient kiosk. People who'd lived here 20 years waved at her like family. Tourists gave her that brief, exaggerated kindness that evaporates at sunset. She was steady with children. She had a knack for judging when to step in without dramatizing, because she had practiced that competence. Once, when a toddler spilled a whole cone and burst into wails, Mara knelt down right away and offered the child a wipe with one hand and a new scoop with the other. The tears stopped as if someone had pulled a curtain over a storm. She and I didn't fall into anything like romance at first. There were flutters, shared coffee on the tailgate of her truck, a joke that landed better than it had any right to, but there was also plumbing work and oil stains. She taught me to check the seal on the cart's canopy, to tighten a frayed hinge so the lid wouldn't scrape Leo's tiny knees when he reached for sprinkles. It was domestic apprenticeship. I kept maps. She kept thermoses. Between us, we built a life that ran on small repairs. We had rituals. Saturday mornings were ours by default. The town was quieter then, the tourists still in their hotels, so we could clock the patience the boardwalk needed. Leo knew every stall by its aroma: cinnamon at the bakery, frying sugar at the donut stand, the lime and mint breath of the juice cart. He liked the way the sun warmed his knee in the wooden bench slits and would press his ear against his folded arms to hear nothing at all. Once, when he was too restless for the Isle of Shells, he took my hand and said the thing that had lodged into me. If she were here, I'd sleep. She, his mother, my sister-in-law, had died on an overcast highway while a truck and a rainstorm argued over who would keep the lane. I didn't tell that part to kids who were not old enough to understand the geometry of loss. For Leo, the fact of absence was a single fact that required compensation rather than explanation. If she's not here, we make a space for sleep. When he said it, he was not asking me to explain death or to promise safety beyond the narrow geography of a bedroom. He wanted the constancy of presence. He wanted someone to make sure there was a person in the doorway when the house got too loud with night. 2 weeks after the funeral, when the papers had been signed and my life had been reconfigured into a new set of responsibilities, I noticed the first of the municipal notices on Mara's cart. It was a small, bureaucratic rectangle stapled to the underside of her canopy. Notice of violation. Unauthorized use of public easement. The paper trembled in the wind the way a person might tremble when someone else read aloud their shortcomings. I kept a copy. I set it in a drawer as if filing a complaint against the future. At first I assumed it was a neighbor complaint, some new resident who resented a vendor's customers appearing on their porch, but the handwriting on the file was perfectly anonymous. A phone call from Sam suggested it could be administrative, a misunderstanding about licenses. Then other things happened subtly. An inspector's truck idled twice in front of the cart. 2 permits were called into question at vague times. Someone took photos of Mara's sign from angles that made the cart look like an obstruction. The town had rules about coastal setbacks and public easements. It had rules that rewarded the houses with good addresses and punished those in the margins. The notices were civilized weapons wielded in civility's clothes. Eleanor Vanderbilt showed up on a Sunday like an inevitability. She lived in a house that had once been someone else's small dream and had been enlarged, painted, and landscaped into a statement. Eleanor's voice contained the kind of soft ice other people preferred not to touch. It was the voice that could calibrate a sentence to sting just enough to be remembered. She did not speak to us directly at first. She sent a letter to the council, attached amphibian-thin legalese to the neighborhood's polite anxieties. She framed her complaints as concern for public safety and aesthetic coherence. She spoke about property values as if they were the weather, natural, immovable, objective. Eleanor believed in systems because systems protected what she owned. Councilman Higgins, a man perpetually sunburned at the edges from endless civic after-hours, read Eleanor's letter and made a perfunctory note. He liked being the man who mediated small-town moralities. He liked being on radio programs where he could call neighbors responsible. "We can't have encroachments," Higgins said once at a coffee meet and greet, and when he said it he gestured to nothing in particular, as if the problem could be dispensed with by tone alone. But behind his public bluster there was bureaucracy. Files, codified ordinances, an allowance for vending under certain conditions. It was all language, and I had spent my professional life crafting and translating that language into maps that meant things. The first hearing had been scheduled as an administrative meeting about a permit. By then, another file had landed on my desk, a tentative petition filed by a distant member of Leo's mother's family, someone with ties and an eye for possibility, asking for guardianship to be reconsidered. The timing was not an accident. If public perception undermined Mara's place here, if the town decided vending was a nuisance and not a right, then Leo's footprint in this neighborhood could be called into question. The implication read like a quiet contingency. If his guardian lived in precarity, so too might his home. I learned how to balance competing deadlines. A city planner's habit is to make options legible. When choices are visible, you can see where they might break. So I began to collect evidence, not of some grand conspiracy, but of ordinances and their dates, of recorded easements on digital scans, of aerial photographs with timestamp overlays. I opened municipal databases with the same methodical care I used to draw property lines. On paper, there was an easement more generous than Eleanor had let anyone believe, and Ordinance C4, the one that permitted certain mobile vendors along public promenades, was precise if read in context. I printed them, annotated them in a margin handwriting that looked like a better version of my childhood notes, and kept them in a folder I carried under my arm like a talisman. I could have submitted those documents quietly. Sam urged caution. "Let the lawyers speak," he texted one afternoon, his bubble of advice perfunctory but steady. The safer course was to let the process proceed and not inflame the town. But one evening in the garage, with a crescent wrench in my hand and grease under my nails from the cart's folding mechanism, I realized that caution was the language of my old life. I had been hired to predict floodlines and mitigate risk. I had not been hired to make moral bets for a child who needed a home. My decision to act publicly was not theatrical. It was a failure of patience mixed with a deep recognition that the quiet can be weaponized against people who have less tempering it. There were small moments that pushed me. Leo's logic was simple. If there was a person who could tuck him in, who would say the words that made night not an unfamiliar country, then the day's edges were blunted. Mara had become that person. She didn't claim it in any tender way. She showed up. After the bicycle incident, when a kid, distracted by a kite, clipped Leo and pinned him to a lamppost for a split second, Mara was already there, scooping him into her arms, apologizing like she bore a responsibility she didn't owe. She asked if he needed a hug. He said no at first, and then his body went slack into her because it recognized shelter. That was the kind of trust that could not be argued away in a council meeting. It was the kind of fact that needed witnesses. So I prepared to testify. The hearing room smelled like coffee and varnish. Its air vents hummed with the same polite administrative drone I've heard in municipal buildings my whole life. People took seats like they were filing into a small theater where the plot was slow and technical. Eleanor's supporters were composed and exact. Higgins sat in the front, his elbows on the polished wood, as if the council table itself conferred some dignity on his posture. Mara took a chair at the end of a row and tightened her hands in her lap. Leo squirmed on my knees and insisted he wanted to draw a house, so I passed him a crayon. His hands moved with that peculiar concentration kids have when they are making things small enough to be safe. When my turn came, I set my printed maps on the table and asked for the room's attention, like a man who had learned to be quiet in public so he could be louder when necessary. I didn't shout. I showed layers, an aerial image from 10 years ago, a scanned deed referencing an easement, a clause in Ordinance C4 that made room for mobile vending under specific protocols. I had timestamps, and I had notes from earlier inspections that showed compliance we had maintained. The audience listened, some eyebrows knitting, others shifting to check a phone, as if my maps were the only complex thing they were allowed to look at that day. Eleanor's counsel was as deft as you'd expect. He turned my maps into opportunities to ask questions that suggested sloppiness rather than malice. Higgins complimented the thoroughness while stressing balance and public interest. When Eleanor stood to speak, she wore a face that was intimately practiced for litigation. It was the face of those who had long ago learned to make every sentence multiply impact. "We simply ask the town to enforce standards that ensure peace and property values," she said. There was a softness in her diction, but the meaning was unyielding. The crowd clapped in a way that sounded pre-approved. The hearing moved in fits of procedure. I had expected argument. I had not expected the private worry that came with visibility. A sympathetic neighbor spoke on my behalf, not for me, but for the fact that a child's life was embedded in the place. Sam sat stoic and ready. At one point he passed a note that read, "Be factual, be concise, don't volunteer." I ignored the second part and did it anyway. I volunteered the story of the bicycle because facts without faces are abstractions. Maps are not enough when a child's breath is the measure. At mid-hearing, a council member asked for clarification on a boundary shown in my exhibit. In the shuffle of paper, the clerk misread a parcel number, an easy human mistake. Eleanor seized it, suggesting that the map evidence was flawed. The room's tone shifted, the way light shifts when clouds pass. Expectation turned to small panic. That misread parcel would have been convenient for an argument against us. For a moment I felt the old temptation, to defer, to let process take its course, to archive my risk in the neat box labeled responsible. Instead, I asked a question that had been brewing. I requested access to the public server where the original data was stored. I wanted the timestamps that would disprove the parcel confusion. Someone in the clerk's office, surprised but not unkind, brought a laptop. Sam mouthed, "Eli." I took the machine like a man who had practiced this in the mirror and then thrown the mirror away. I logged in and pulled the server file. It was technical, dry, but it contained what I needed. Recorded updates, timestamps, and the scanned deed in its source folder. The server recorded when the easement had been accepted and by whom. It documented a correction made 3 years earlier that aligned with my maps. I displayed it on the council's monitor and spoke in a voice that came out steadier than my heartbeat. The parcel in question remains under public easement. The Ordinance C4 allows vending along this promenade, with the conditions met by the vendor's current setup. I did not frame it as a moral truth, but as a technical one. Facts tidy up arguments. There was a moment of silence after that demonstration, one of the sharpest of the day. Silence in a council room is not the hush of a bedroom, but it had some of that quality, an attention so full it wanted to be careful. The silence did not feel like victory. Eleanor's mouth made a single thin line. Higgins adjusted his glasses. A murmur circled the room like a breeze. The deputy clerk cleared her throat and read protocol. The council would vote on whether the enforcement action would proceed. It did not feel terminal. It felt provisional, like a roof under construction. Simultaneously, my custody arrangements were far from settled. The petition that might have tugged Leo into someone else's home was still on the county's calendar. I had not told anyone this at the hearing, not because I wanted to conceal, but because the escalation would have seemed spectacular, and I hoped unnecessary. When Sam and I left the building, he didn't congratulate me with bright words so much as grip my shoulder and say, "You chose visibility." That choice was, in his vocabulary, a risk. It might change how a judge saw me, the man who had brought municipal disputes into public light. Judges like discretion. Prosecutors like precedent. Our choice was leverage, but leverage could be described as folly by someone who wanted to reduce parental claims to boxes. We did not win outright that day. The vote on the vendor enforcement was tabled pending further review, an outcome that sounded technical but carried the whole weight of the town's lingering question. Were we a community that made space for people who kept their promises to children, or a community run by the calculus of property and provenance? The tabling meant time, and time in this case was both ally and threat. Time allowed us to organize neighborhood testimony. Time also allowed opponents to marshal their own narratives. After the hearing, Eleanor's eyes found me like a compass finding true north. She was efficient even in irritation. There was no dramatic cry from her, only a shift to arithmetic. More letters, more appeals, a legal strategy that was methodical. That night I sat with Leo in the dark, the house quiet in a way that made every sound honor itself. He slept with his cheek against my chest, breathing slow and resigned into the softness of the pillow. I could feel a kind of silence fall, that same silence that seemed to follow me when I left the old life. It was not entirely peaceful. Under it lay the residue of anxiety, the knowledge that we had entered a different breed of responsibility where ordinary routines could be used as evidence against us. In the following weeks, the town's edges sharpened. Anonymous calls to code enforcement increased. Someone left a polite but threatening letter on Mara's cart, phrased as neighborhood concern. The cart's metal hinges began to squeak from being opened too many times, and I spent more evenings with oil cans than with spreadsheets. I tightened bolts under the canopy and tuned its engine until it purred in a way that satisfied Mara's practical ear. It was small domestic labor that felt like scaffolding. Every bolt turned was a promise that the cart would open tomorrow to serve ice cream, that the rhythm of Saturday mornings could continue. We started to build a more honest map of what our family would be. We were not a household of tidy good examples. We were a makeshift clan stitched together in the margins. Mara's life was her work and the ness of it. She didn't ask to be a heroine. She asked to be recognized as someone competent enough to provide and kind enough to protect. Leo's needs were simple and immense. He needed someone to pick him up when he fell, and to say the same 3 sentences every night until they became talismans of sleep. One night, about 2 months after the hearing, I woke to the sound of a truck idling outside. The cart's hood had been left a fraction ajar, and in that small mistake, I understood why Eleanor had targeted something so ordinary as a vendor's place of business. Power is not always exercised by spectacle. It is often practiced patiently, with policy and with the habit of using systems to make the small things unlivable. I went out and sat on the curb and listened to the engine until it sputtered. I thought about the way I had left my old self behind, Not in a single step, but in 1,000 small absences. Once I would have measured that loss by promotion missed, or a committee I had let lapse. Now I measured it in the absence of predictable privacy, the surrender of a career's unobtrusive continuity. When the custody hearing came, it was a different space altogether. It had less theater than the council room and more surgical sobriety. The judge's bench was polished and official, and somehow smaller up close. The petitioner's attorney spoke in the precise language of care plans, quoting stuffy standards as if to make compassion into a checklist. My own presentation was a ledger of presents, daycare receipts, notes from pediatric visits, photographs of Leo at the park, and testimonies from neighbors who had watched him build sandcastles for whole summers. Sam advised me with technical kindness, but left the moral arguments to me. "Answer plainly," he said. "Don't make this a war." There is a certain vulnerability to laying out domestic life in a courtroom. To read aloud pictures of toothbrushes and storybooks is to present intimacy as evidence. Yet the judge looked on, dispassionate but not hostile, and I realized the gravity of what I had chosen. I had left a career of careful detachment for work that required me to be seen as responsible in a different register. I had weighed the risk of visibility against the tooth and nail of staying invisible and letting systems determine my nephew's fate. The ruling granted me structured guardianship, formal enough that it would give us stability, delicate enough that it left room for future petitions. The judge praised the neighborhood testimony and urged all parties to work toward a child-centered arrangement. It was provisional, as most things are in civic life. That provision felt like a window emergent from a wall, an opening but not a door. I left the courthouse with a folder that contained my new standing and the knowledge that legal stability is never a total assurance. It is an agreement enforced by people who wake up and choose to honor it or not. We celebrated quietly. There was no triumphant parade, only a dinner of takeout and a birthday candle we left unlit. Gestures of gratitude shaped by the edges of what had been won. We learned to sleep more easily. Leo slept with the small life of a child who felt held. When he murmured in the tiny hours and I stepped into the doorway, or when Mara hummed while washing dishes, there was a hush, a domestic kind of silence that wrapped itself around us like fabric. For the first time since the crash, silence felt like a place to be rather than a thing to be afraid of. But silence is ambivalent. It could be sanctuary, but it could also be the space where threats gather. I learned to hear its difference. The quiet after a council meeting is public, edged with the knowledge of mouths that might speak later. The quiet in a child's bedroom is private, the hush of breaths synchronized and safe. The silence that followed me after I left my old identity was both those things, a relief and an exposure. It allowed me to hear Leo breathe. It also allowed me to hear the muffled noises of a town that might decide tomorrow what our lives could be worth. We built rituals. Baths on Tuesdays, pancakes on slow Sundays, a bedtime reading of a book Leo loved that involved a boat and an improbable sunrise. His drawings accumulated on the refrigerator door, houses with doors big enough for the sun to walk through, stick figures with waving arms. I taped one of his small creations into the cover of a file I kept, a crayon house with 3 windows and a sun with teeth. Bits of his life became anchors. The sound of Mara's laugh when she said something private to him, the particular way he arranged his stuffed animals by a guardrail he invented for their bed. The domestic, in its repetition, was our fortress. There were quieter, practical moments that surprised me with their tenderness. Fixing the cart's hinge with a strap and a bolt, holding the metal in a way that required both pressure and patience, felt like a metaphor for what I had been doing with ourselves. I learned to do tiny domestic repairs with steady hands. Mara, who had taught me how to secure a canopy, would roll her sleeves and show me again, patient the way teachers are, when they expect you to become competent rather than clever. "You left a lot for this," she said once, not as accusation but as acknowledgement. Outside of our small domesticity, the town kept running its old circuits. Eleanor continued to file motions, Higgins continued to posture, and anonymous complaints found new forms. I filed responses, attended meetings, and sometimes stood in council rooms like a man who had traded restraint for the clarifying exposure of facts. There is a certain clarity to being the person who will testify. Your lines are spelled out for you. But there is also a cost. The edges of your life are now visible to people who have never had to look after the small, ordinary things. Silence followed me in other ways. At night I caught myself listening for the particular cadence of Leo's inhale and exhale, like a tide I had to learn. When work emails came, requests for consultation, invitations to panels about urban resilience, I found it harder to answer with my old brisk efficiency. I would sit with a choice, accept, and re-enter the old orbit, decline, and deepen the new one. I left the invitations on read more frequently. There were clients who understood, and clients who wrote as if my absence were a professional lapse. I booked fewer flights. I chose a local project instead of a national committee. Each declined email felt like another small leaving, another surrender of a thing that had once been me. Mara watched these shifts with a steadiness that sometimes startled me. She never said I had to choose. She made coffee and left it on the counter in mugs that matched small gestures of belonging. Once, after a long Sunday where the council clerk had called to postpone the vote, we sat on the seawall and watched the tide polish the sand. The silence there was thick and near sacred. "You left something," she said, handing me a mug. "Not everyone can do that." It didn't feel like leaving at the time, I admitted. It felt like failing to show up for an appointment. She snorted, which for her meant both amusement and tenderness. "You left a safe suit and you came to the part of town that keeps its promises with bolts and bandages," she said. "That's not failure." That line, she said it without drama, like someone stating the weather, stayed with me. It reframed the title I had been carrying around in my head. I had left something in a literal sense, meetings, committees, the idea of a tidy career. But the real departure was more intimate. I had left the pretense that my life could be unaltered by grief. I had left the illusion that I could calculate all variables from a place of distance. When I left, silence followed. Sometimes it was a friend, sometimes a warning. There were days when the silence turned into a thing full of small alarms. Leo would wake at odd hours, and his breathing would go jagged. I'd go to him and find a small body in need of comfort, and the soft, certain hand of being held. Those nights were noisier than the daytime hearings, whispers, footsteps, the rustle of blankets. When he finally settled, there would be a hush, and in that space I learned to hear myself differently. I listened not for the hum of fluorescent lights in a conference room, but for the click of a story ending in a child's bedroom. The town's threats never became the stuff of thrillers. No hidden cabals, no dramatic sabotage. The tactics were mundane and bureaucratic. A permit delayed, a fine assessed for a technicality, a statement circulated to neighbors reminding them of standards, small things. But small things are a cumulative force if someone wants to rearrange a life. My work as a planner taught me that erosion is rarely spectacular. It is a polite, patient thing that nudges at foundations until they are unsteady. The partial victory at the hearing had given us space to breathe and build habits. We built dinners from rotation, something I could make quickly and something Mara wanted to attempt. Leo learned to feed himself in a way that made us proud, spilling less each week. We began to find joy in the predictable. Saturday cones at Mara's cart, the way she fraudulently let him choose extra sprinkles when the crowd had thinned. The small ritual of tucking him in and asking the same two questions. "What was the thing you liked today? And do you have anything that worries you?" He would answer with things like a big crab or the dark, and we would make replies sufficient to make night manageable. There were moments of pure, ordinary intimacy that taught me the limits of public acts. Once, after a long day of bureaucratic wrangling, Mara stayed late to fix a hinge while I held a flashlight. The light caught the oil on our hands and made it luminous. She glanced up and said, "You risked a lot today." I did not deny it. What I wanted to say was far simpler, that the risk had been worth seeing a small boy sleep through the night because he believed someone would be there. Not all courage is loud. Most of it is a ledger of small, repetitive tasks performed because someone else trusts you to do them. The silence that followed me sometimes returned as a tangible companion. I would walk the boardwalk at dusk, when the gulls had become shadows and the lamp-post's light turned the planks into long ribbons. I would sometimes catch a glint of a past self in the reflection of a shop window. A younger man with a briefcase and a suit, eyes keen for zoning problems. He looked at the boardwalk like a project. I looked at it like a neighborhood. The difference was not only professional, it was moral. I had left an identity where my work defined my worth. I had swapped it for a life where worth came from staying when someone else needed you. Occasionally, hired consultants called. "Eli Thorne, your expertise is requested," they would say in a voice that made my name into a product. I would answer politely and decline. The cost of those projects was not monetary alone. It was time and the absorption into a system that preferred predictable, tidy outputs to the messy obligations of family. To decline a contract that would have paid well but required me to travel meant saying yes to a small, domestic truth, that for now, Leo comes first. That choice was not a tragedy. It was a shape. Silence followed me in a different register at the edge of the town's dawns. In the early mornings, the ocean would cast off light in long wedges, and the whole place felt like an unmade bed. I would stand on the seawall with a thermos and watch fishermen knot lines into patterns I couldn't read. Mara sometimes brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Leo slept in the back of the car on those mornings, limp and untroubled. The quiet of those hours felt reclaimed rather than imposed. I could hear the soft creak of the cart as if it were a living thing waking. It was a silence that permitted possibility. When the town's reevaluation of enforcement returned, we were not alone. Neighbors who had eaten Mara's ice cream for years came forward with statements. A teacher from the school mentioned how Mara had once stayed late to help a parent who had lost track of a child's belongings. A woman from the Historic Society said the promenade had always been a space for people, as much as for galleries. These were not spectacular acts. They were testimonies of routine fidelity. They mattered because they painted a portrait of a life that made a child's sleep possible. The council finally moved to dismiss the enforcement action. It was not a victory sung on streets. It was a line in a document that read, "No action at this time." In legal terms, it was procedural. In human terms, it was a relief. The cart stayed. The town, in its halting way, decided to permit the small thing as part of its communal texture. There was a collective exhale, a return to rhythms. The silence that had followed me shifted again. It became quieter in a way that let me hear the soft keys of a child's breath and not the rustle of complaint letters. Months later, when I took Leo to the exact bench where he had first said those words, he climbed up and sat with his knees together. He wore the knitted cap Mara had given him, the same one whose pattern matched her apron. The sun caught the salt in his hair and turned it into something bright. He looked at me and then at the curve of the sea, and he said, in a voice that took on the authority of growth, "If she's here, I sleep." He said it like a fact now, not a plea. I felt a whole small life hang in that sentence. I sat beside him and felt the silence fold around us, not as absence but as presence. I thought about what I had left. Not only meetings and a tidy career, but an old way of defining myself. I had left professional anonymity and entered a life where my hands were known by grease and the shapes of children's crayon drawings. The cost was ongoing, measured in declined schedules and the quiet work of evenings. The reward was immediate. A child who could sleep because someone was standing in his doorway. There is a lesson in the quiet, if you let it teach you. Silence can be a balm, an empty place where fear subsides and the soft work of a home takes root. Silence can also be a warning, a place where quiet systems of power accumulate pressure in the small gaps of people's days. I learned to live with both readings. I built our days to make the former outweigh the latter. If you had asked me, when I'd first started drawing lines on maps for a living, whether I would one day find myself oiling hinges on a vendor's cart and testifying in a council chamber with a child's drawing folded into my file, I might have answered with a theoretical curiosity. Now, with Leo asleep at home and the cart's metal humming softly under schedule, I would answer differently. I left a life that used lines to protect property and replaced it with a life where the lines I drew were for the shape of a child's day. The silence that followed me was patient and complex, sometimes comfort, sometimes caution, always a new kind of responsibility. Stay with me a little longer and think about what you might leave if being present called for it. What would you risk to make a small life find its night's peace? The town never stopped humming with small politics, neither did Eleanor's letters cease entirely. We remained vigilant in that little, sensible way custodians of a life must be. But the worst of the loud things had calmed into the background. We found our domestic choreography. Baths, bedtime, the particular way Leo folded his hands when he wanted something he didn't quite know how to ask for. The routine was a muscle we exercised until it felt like second nature. One evening, months after the council's tentative reprieve, I sat at the kitchen table and watched Leo fall asleep with a stuffed boat clasped to his chest. The house was dark except for the knot of light radiating from the hallway. In that hush, the silence felt like something that could be listened to, a presence rather than a lack. It traced the outline of what I had left and the shape of what had replaced it. Not an identity lost, but a different way to count worth. There is a clarity that arrived finally in the small hours. Leaving need not mean disappearing. When I left my old career's cadence, a silence followed me. It accompanied me into rooms where doubts live, and into doorways where a child waits. It kept company in good ways and in worrying ones. It let me hear the slow rise and fall of a small chest at rest. It let me hear Mara humming as she wiped a plate. It let me know that something had shifted so deeply that there was no going back to being a man who charted cities for a living, at the expense of not knowing where his nephew slept. I do not tell this story as a neat parable or as a guidebook. I tell it because small lives are made by small decisions, and because sometimes those decisions require leaving the safety of a self you once relied upon. The silence that followed me was not a judgment. It was a new landscape where the work of guardianship happened in quiet detail. It is not a silence of endings only. It is the quiet of presence, the hush after the engine has stopped, and everyone in the room remembers to breathe. If you have your own story of leaving, of what you gave up, what you gained, what followed in the hush, share it. Tell someone who might recognize the pattern. For now, if you liked listening to this, there's more of these kinds of quiet, human stories. Subscribe and come back. We tell ourselves things in the dark to steady our hands. We tell each other stories in daylight to remember how to keep our promises. On the night I finally stopped packing my suitcases, I left them in the closet with a small stack of files on top. Leo slept through it. Mara hummed in the kitchen. The silence that followed me then settled like dust on the windowsill. Soft, visible if you looked, and holding whatever small future we were building. I had left an old life. The silence followed, sometimes heavy and sometimes kind, and in its company I learned to hear the ordinary miracles of a child's steady breath.